Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for convening for our final panel. We have a roundtable this evening, but more on that in about an hour. I would like to welcome back Ben Hurlbut, who spoke yesterday. He'll be providing comments following Professor Jansenov's comments in a moment. I'd like to introduce Professor Sheila Jansenov as the Forsheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the Harvard Kennedy School. She is a pioneer in the social sciences, as she explores the role of science and technology in the law, politics, and policy of modern democracy. Her books include The Fifth Branch, Science at the Bar, Designs on Nature, The Ethics of Invention, and Can Science Make Sense of Life? She founded and directs the STS program at Harvard, where she also formed the Science and Democracy Network. In 2022, she received the Government of Norway's Holberg Prize for Law, Humanities, and Social Sciences. Her other honors include the SSRC's Hirschman Prize, the Humboldt Foundation's Reimar Lust Award, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. Professor Jansenov has held distinguished visiting professorships at leading universities in Europe, Asia, Australia, and the United States. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. She's a foreign member of the British Academy and the Royal Danish Academy, and member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She served on the AAAS Board of Directors and as president of the Society for Social Studies of Science. She holds an AB, JD, and PhD degrees from Harvard, as well as honorary doctorates from the universities of Twente and Liège. And with that, I would invite Professor Jansenov to give her comments on the University of La Sapienza lecture that we discussed originally yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really, truly sorry that I can't be there in person, but this invitation came on my teaching days. And of course, there's certain sacrosanct things about classrooms in our lives. And so I wasn't able to get away. But thank you for making room for me in this remote and less satisfying way anyway. So first of all, when this invitation came from Father Kimes, I was both honored and totally daunted. I mean, what would I, as a secular STS scholar, have conceivably to say about the trajectory of our most recent but one pope, and what do I know about Catholicism anyway, beyond what the ordinary educated person does, and a papal legacy is a pretty big thing to comment on. It seemed like the wrong thing to be asked to do for all kinds of reasons. But then there is a very powerful advocate sitting at the desk there who persuaded me that I should take a look and find things. And indeed, that is in a way the sort of meta text for this whole set of comments, that when one does take a closer look, one finds extraordinary convergences and provocative divergences as well in the most unlikely places. And it's to that topic that I want to speak today. So I will share my screen because especially when you're talking about a text, it's helpful to have the pieces of text that have energized one's own thoughts as a kind of shared bridge with the audience. So I will now go ahead and do that. Yeah, so this conference is on Benedict XVI's legacy, and the particular conversation that I'm supposed to be engaging in with Ben later is on the subtopic of faith, science, and technology. If you're a scholar in the field of science and technology studies, you think of science itself as having a lot of faith in it, and technology for sure. So faith almost seems redundant. Maybe it's religion, science, and technology as different aggregators of faith, but with that small caveat that faith is present everywhere, let me go on to talk about the particular text, this lecture that was never actually delivered. There's something a little bit symbolic in that as well, at the University of Rome at La Sapienza. I've looked at one or two others of the texts that you've been talking about, and I know that Pope Benedict, as himself a scholar and a distinguished theology professor, liked laying out the territory on which he was speaking. And of course, his role as the shepherd in chief of the Catholic Church was always on his mind. But I was struck at the way in which he distinguished or sought to distinguish what the central mission was of the audience that he was speaking to as compared with what he saw as his own mission. Certainly, this is the way he opens his lecture and structures it at La Sapienza. So he goes there saying that, in a way, this is the spinal column of the presentation. What is the nature and mission of the papacy, and what is the nature and mission of the university? And around those two sets of questions, if you imagine them as two poles of the barbell, he builds the discourse that is this particular lecture. So he says that, first of all, the university was constructed or was taken over eventually as the site of public studies, studium urbis, so in the city, a place of study belonging to the city and not the church. And yet the name La Sapienza, or wisdom, could be claimed by any institution of higher learning, any institution that claims to understand the wisdom of the human condition. The motto I was interested to see of the university is Il futuro è passato qui. So the future is the past here, which reminded me of the text we have up on the US archives, the pastor's prologue. So there is this sense that whether you're talking about church or whether you're talking about city or state, a place of study is this place of temporal intersection, a place where somehow the past is a beacon for the future, and in a way it's the present that is the curious point of intersectionality at which we look back with imperfect understandings of both the past and the future. And so that is, in a sense, the kind of ground zero that where one doesn't quite understand things like nature and mission, because it's always an amalgam of whatever it is that one thinks one understands about what has been and the as yet untold directions of the future, the what is to come. So I thought I would take the text and talk about it from the standpoint of my own discipline, but tracing places where I saw that kind of intersection between an understanding of past and a foretelling or forecasting, or at least speculation about the future to be happening in the body of the text. And these I've grouped under these 5 headings: truth and tradition, epistemic charity, the is and the ought, public reason, and because this is a conference about Benedict's legacy, the question of legacy and renewal itself. Okay, so on truth and tradition, the text draws a kind of distinction at one level between the kind of search for truth that animates university inquiry, especially in universities committed to the study of the sciences, natural sciences, but also a scientific study of all manner of human questions and understandings, between that tradition of truth-seeking and the tradition of truth-seeking that Benedict saw as embodied in the church, and his role as his pastoral role as leading people into the traditions of the church. So faced with an ahistorical form of reason that seeks to establish itself exclusively in terms of ahistorical rationality, the wisdom of the great religious traditions should be valued as a heritage that can't be cast with impunity into the dustbin of the history of ideas. So it's not merely relegatable to the history of ideas. Tradition, in other words, is a living force. It is something that is alive. And I hope we'll come back to this in the discussion as well, Ben, because, truth is sometimes thought about as a sterile, static condition of the world, whereas tradition is something that lives. It lives in ritual, lives in practices and in manifestations, and that is something that prevents it from being cast with impunity into the dustbin of history. At the same time, the origin of the university lies in a kind of universal thirst, a thirst for knowledge that is proper to man. So here's something being said about the very foundational place of truth seeking in the purposes of being human. The human being wants to know what everything around him is. To some extent, I heard here overtones or undertones of the naming of things in the Garden of Eden by Adam, a kind of almost a nominalism about what everything around him is. He wants truth, Benedict says in 3 simple words. Pilate's question, he then says, becomes unavoidable. What is truth? But he segues quickly to something that STS scholars recognize as today inevitable in any discussion of truth, because truth isn't truth until we recognize it as such. And that then opens up a second order question. How can it be recognized? And then perhaps a methodological third order question about what are the practices that we must engage in order to recognize the truth as truth? And I will say that I think it's in something of those practices that the differences between the scientific, something that Benedict called ahistorical rationality, those approaches to truth-seeking compare with the more faith-grounded or faith-based, overtly faith-based approaches to asking about the truth of the human condition as well, the wisdom of the great religious traditions. And so then we understand this sentence in context, that the wisdom of the great religious traditions then should be valued as a heritage. So there's the idea of a legacy that is handed on. So how do these different modes of inquiring after the truth, the ahistorical one and the one that is deeply grounded in a history and understanding the legacy of human wisdom, how do these talk to one another? And another thing that I found interesting about this text is that it practices so obviously what I teach my students who are coming from different disciplines to practice about the texts they read, written by other disciplinarians. So I almost heard the discourse never given to La Sapienza as a kind of invitation to interdisciplinarity. And then it's interesting to see rhetorically and intellectually what Benedict does to invite this kind of conversation with people who are standing on the other side, on the ahistorical rationality side of the ledger, in a sense. And the ways in which he speaks of Rawls and Habermas in particular struck me as quite indicative, quite symptomatic of the ways in which he displays this trait that in my classes I call epistemic charity. So how I define epistemic charity is, before you pull out the sort of big guns of critique, first try to understand the author's intentions in the light of the author's own mission. What is the author trying to achieve? And how does one evaluate that argument, the argument made in a paper, in the light of the author's own objectives and own purposes? And then, after displaying that epistemic charity, one can then launch into critique. So in talking about John Rawls, Benedict obviously recognizes that for Rawls, the distinction between the public and the private put religion on the private side of the boundary, and hence it was not somewhere in the public domain, the public that is here put in quotations in this lecture text. So while denying that comprehensive religious doctrines have the character of public reason, nonetheless at least sees their non-public reason as one which cannot simply be dismissed. So this is epistemic charity at its most central, that just because you do not buy into that mode of reasoning does not mean that you dismiss it by those who maintain a rigidly secularized rationality. So you can't use a preordained boundary between the religious and the secular to say, well, what is on the religion side is simply private. And here the Pope is according to John Rawls the virtue of recognizing that this is not a way to proceed with other traditions. So Rawls perceives a criterion of this reasonableness, among other things, in the fact that such doctrines derive from a, and here are the important words, responsible and well thought out tradition. So tradition here is not just a matter of ritual, it's also a matter of thinking through, having its own modes of argumentation, and it's responsible. So it's accountable. It is not simply random. It is not solipsistic. It is something that assumes that there are better and worse ways of going about the argumentation, which over lengthy periods has developed these satisfactory arguments in support of the doctrines concerned. So there is a different kind of respect and weight to be accorded, and this he attributes to Rawls's own thinking, to traditions which, although foreign to the one that Rawls himself espouses, nevertheless have some of these properties of public reason built into them. So I think that this way of finding in the secular other a justification or a validation of how religion justifies itself is a kind of ultimate act of epistemic charity. It's saying that I recognize that even in your critique, you have a place for where I am coming from. And then similarly, he does that a little less overtly with Habermas. So he says that the process of argumentation that Habermas is a proponent of requires the public to be boiled down, to be represented in various ways. And these representatives are principally political parties, and we know of these from at least Edmund Burke onwards. And inasmuch as these are responsible for the formation of political will, I mean, of course, one could have a conversation about this particular point. I mean, why is it the political parties that are responsible for the formation of political will at this moment in America? Arguably, the forces of organized religion are having as much responsibility for the formation of political will. Is there a tacit criterion of good political will being discussed under the surface of this text? But in any case, the point here is that the majorities that will come out of this kind of argumentation, this kind of tending to the multifaceted or pluralist character of a society, will inevitably attend to the interests that they promise to satisfy, even though the interests are often particular. So here we see the text doing a kind of bridging, sort of suggesting that even behind the universalism of the rational process of argumentation, the reasonableness of the process that is thereby constituted, are particularities, and these do not truly serve the whole. So what do we then turn to? We look at the subordination. I mean, so sensibility to the truth, a phrase that is repeated and that I'll come back to in a minute, is subordinated to the sensibility to interests. So then he finds it significant that Habermas speaks of sensibility to the truth. So not the acquisition of the truth, not truth as an endpoint, and not a particular doctrinal approach to the truth, but a sensibility to the truth as a necessary element in the process of political argument. So again, we find the treatment of Habermas to be a charitable treatment and an attempt to do a kind of bridge building between dissimilar starting points, to some degree dissimilar endpoints, but nevertheless a thing in the middle that is not itself truth, but um, um, sorry, the this idea of the sensibility to truth, a leaning toward. In my mind, I saw a compass in a sense. All right. The next point I want to make is about the is and the ought. And in a sense, this is, I put this in the middle because it is probably the most significant crossover between the ways in which some of us do science and technology studies today and this particular text that I approached with trepidation, then curiosity, and then a kind of welcome. So this is actually taken from one of the other texts because it wasn't expressed quite as clearly. Oops, I keep moving somehow between slides. It wasn't expressed quite as clearly in the La Sapienza text that I was given to comment on. But in this speech to the Bundestag in 2011, Benedict says, if nature, in the words of Hans Kelsen, is viewed as an aggregate of objective data linked together in terms of cause and effect, then indeed no ethical indication of any kind can be derived from it. So this is a critique of positivism. I mean, if objective data are all that lie behind claims of cause and effect, and this is what positivist social science, in this case, positivist juridical studies are supposed to be doing, then where is the place of ethics? But then, as he says in a later sentence, the great proponent of legal positivism, Kelsen, at the age of 84 in 1965, abandoned the dualism of is and ought. So I stopped at that sentence for a variety of reasons. I mean, so of course, crossing the threshold of that decade is meaningful for me in a year in which I've done that crossing myself, and finding that somebody's being praised for being able to abandon anything at that age is seen as itself a form of higher rationality was to some degree amusing to read about. But, if one reads about the artists who did not die in their prime but attained respectable old ages, one sees somewhat of the same kind of admiration for a shedding of certain positivist inclinations. So if one looks at the portraits of a Rembrandt or the painterly strokes of a Titian, one finds a kind of commitment to, or Turner for that matter, a kind of literalist idea of truth, usually in the earlier works, and then a far more loose-flowing understanding of how the elements of the picture will get put together. So I was thinking that in this sort of paean to the possibility of evolution, the possibility of reaching other forms of understanding, Benedict was celebrating the notion of tradition in a different way. I mean, that a person can be the guardian of the evolution of their own thoughts, and these then can evolve in certain ways. And then he says that, should we then ask questions about objectivity and the objectivity that is enshrined in nature? Is it really pointless to wonder whether the objective reason that manifests itself in nature does not presuppose a creative reason, a creator or spiritus? Well, so that is the religious mind turning to a question about objectivity, a question that those even steeped in the traditions of objectivity, such as a Hans Kelsen, are seen as having abandoned or moved away from, shied away from later in their lives. So I want to suggest that this is not just a matter of a person realizing something about the more constrained character of their own thinking and the ways in which they outgrew or abandoned sense of objectivity for a sense of a more organic whole, but that it's possible to come at it from within the life world of the sciences themselves. So the kind of tradition in STS that Ben Herbert and I both represent is the one that represents itself as co-production. And so co-production, like many English words, has different sorts of meanings. But within STS, this is the sort of short version that's sometimes quoted, and it's a sentence that I wrote a while back now. It's shorthand for the proposition that the ways in which we know and represent the world, both nature and society, are inseparable from the ways in which we chose to live in those worlds. So both know and represent. The representation is important, and we can come back. Natural and social sciences, so everything that is in a philosophical faculty in a sense, and not that there's a causal relationship, but that the very commitment to particular ways of knowing the world, even the idea of commitment, the word commitment, that I want to know the world in this way, is not detachable from how we have decided to live in it. So I provide one concrete example in the paragraph where I first introduced this, or in the page where I first introduced this idea. What happens in science and technology, I say, is interwoven with issues of meaning, values, and power in ways that demand sustained critical inquiry. And the critical is important there because it suggests there are still questions to be asked. So consider, for example, the transformation of a sheep named Dolly, born of a virgin mother in an obscure laboratory, etc., into a universally recognized symbol. And what was significant about Dolly at the time that I wrote this, which is more than 20 years ago, is that lots of people saw the symbolic meaning of Dolly, but whether it was a symbol of progress or whether it was a symbol of moral transgression, for that one had to reach into other traditions that give meaning to our existence, traditions that are in that sense moral, political, ethical, but inseparable from the representation of Dolly. What is Dolly a sign of in our world? What do we even call this thing? If it's a clone, what are the ideas that are associated with cloning, and where do they derive their emotional, their ethical, their moral resonance from? And then I say, in short, the ways in which we take note of new phenomena. It could be all phenomena, but we notice that particularly when something new is coming on board, are tied at all points to the ways in which we have already chosen to live in it. So from this standpoint, science and technology studies, which is very much a child of the Enlightenment and hence from within the halls of the sciences themselves, is itself a critical tradition that says, is the other tradition that has rendered science apolitical, non-ethical, because the ethics comes from outside, and purely objective, itself a good way of scientifically understanding the sciences themselves. So in that sense, we don't necessarily need only to juxtapose foreign traditions against the native one, if I can put it that way, to get at critique, that to some degree the critique is alive and thriving even inside these territories. And then one can ask some questions about what is the difference between one kind of critique and another. So where does this have effects? Well, it has effects. I mean, how we think about faith, science, and technology will have effects in the public world, the world of action, where you have to persuade people through public reason that you are doing something that is justified, that is valid, and so on. So the legitimacy of a constitutional charter as a basis for what's legal derives, Benedict says, from two sources: from the equal participation of citizens in the political process and from the reasonable manner in which political disputes are resolved. So one way in which co-production might take issue with this is it two sources, or is it that the equal participation of citizens in the process itself constitutes and is constituted by what we see as the reasonable manner in which to resolve political disputes? And then the notion that public reason is not an ending the debate question, but one that opens up to further questions. So if Rawls has recourse to public reason, what is reasonable? How is reason shown to be true? I mean, so this goes back to the prior question of how do we understand, how do we recognize the truth when we see it? Similarly, how do we know that reason is true? And that requires a form of meta-analysis. And then that public reason should not then be claimed only by the natural sciences that have their own ways of addressing those questions. But the history of humanism that has grown out of the Christian faith demonstrates the truth of this faith in its essential nucleus, that it relates to all of humanity. That, in turn, gives it a claim upon public reason. So it's a playing upon public reason in the Rawlsian sense of detaching it from faith and understanding of the total human condition, but then coming around and saying that if what we're after is a kind of universalism, then surely the Christian faith, with its foundations in a history of humanism itself, has a claim to be recognized as a form of public reason. So with that, let me turn to the legacy point. And, so old age may bring a form of legacy making. But I think that I would like to read Benedict's legacy as a series of invitations. And so much of the text brought to mind T.S. Eliot, and in particular Little Gidding, which is a poem that's widely regarded as being itself a kind of bridge-building exercise. I mean, so this was a poet who favored a form of high Anglicanism with very close connections to Catholicism. And in Little Gidding, he juxtaposes various dualities, but the dualities that he then resolves seem to me to bear on this question of, well, so whither should one take a legacy? And are we interested in legacy as such? I mean, is it just I hereby with my will set aside this many millions of dollars, or is it a legacy that itself is about regeneration? So you are not here to verify, instruct yourself, or inform curiosity or carry report. I think every young science student entering Harvard might be given these words by a preceding Harvard graduate. You are here to kneel where prayer has been valid. And needless to say, that prayer does not have to be religious prayer or done in a church. It's a prayer for a kind of collective enterprise that has been validated. We have here a statue, which is called the statue of I think it's Three Lies, but anyway, at least Three Lies. John Harvard sitting in front of University Hall, and John Harvard's left foot is very shiny, brass-colored, while the rest of the statue is patinated and bronzed. And why? Because people come and touch that foot. And I once asked somebody why they were doing that, and it wasn't anything to do even with universities. It was just a sense that one's wishes would be granted. If that isn't here to kneel where prayer has been valid, and that a university is not just a place to verify, instruct oneself, or inform curiosity or carry a report, but something sacral, something beyond that. Now, the something beyond that can be very uncomfortable. And so in the middle of that poem, Eliot goes on a little excursus about old age. It's not about discovering what lies back of objectivity to set a crown upon your lifetime's effort, the rending pain of reenactment of all that you have done and been, the shame of things ill done and done to others harm, which once you took for exercise of virtue. And the La Sapienza lecture does have that kind of humility, the remembering that the church's doctrines have not always led to a heightening of virtue, and yet it is a starting point. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. So again, this beginning and ending, ending and beginning, that it's not the same place. We come back, we re-ask those questions, but we re-ask those questions in a different way with a different set of understandings. And I think that that is the heartland of why one does epistemic charity in my sort of way of thinking about it. So, to paraphrase, one might even say that this was the permanent and true purpose. And he talks about the theological and the philosophical faculties, but one could say both science and faith to be custodians of a sensibility to the truth, not to allow humans, just to be a little more modern about who we include, to be distracted from their search for the truth. And so I'll end by saying that if we're going to open up our minds to these diverse ways of searching for the truth, recognize that legacy means, in effect, a kind of renewal of knowing the place for the first time, then we have to include in our understanding traditions of truth-making that perhaps never quite subscribed to the particular truth-making traditions of the Western world as described in this lecture. In India, there is this is the top of the Ashoka pillar on which the Emperor Ashoka inscribed his edicts, which were, after all, a marriage of law and theology. These were not separate faculties on these Ashokan pillars. But it also goes with the motto of the Indian state, perhaps a symbolically important time to be citing that motto as India heads to the polls in search of, I'm not sure what truth today, but it means truth will always conquer, Satyam Eva Jayate. And in that understanding of truth, there never was a bifurcation. There never was a sense that the is different from the ought. The is and the ought come together, as I think Eric Erickson saw in his brilliant biography of Gandhi that he called Gandhi's truth. So I think by looking at other traditions that have always drawn the boundaries a bit differently, but have continually wrestled with the same set of concerns, what is this sensibility to truth? How does it lodge within the human and in relation to other humanistic sensibilities and yearnings? And how do we, upon returning to the same place and knowing it for the first time, know how to ask the next generation of questions? And with that, let me thank you.
I'm sorry, is this... can you hear me? Sheila, can you hear me? Okay, good. So I have all sorts of things I'd love for us to talk about, but let's just make this a conversation. And I actually want to start where you started, Sheila. One of the things that I think is quite interesting about this speech, and maybe I'll just quote it, is this quite remarkable place where Benedict ends up after having begun with a kind of invocation of the tradition of the autonomy of the university and its responsibility to truth and nothing but the truth, so to speak. This is in the very last paragraph of the speech, if you happen to have it there. Over and above his ministry as shepherd of the church, and on the basis of the intrinsic nature of this pastoral ministry, it is the Pope's task to safeguard sensibility to the truth, to invite reason to set out ever anew in search of what is good and true, he goes on, in search of God, to urge reason, in the course of this search to discern the illuminating lights that have emerged during the history of the Christian faith, and just thus to recognize Jesus Christ as the light that illuminates history and helps us find the path towards the future. If one stops, though, in the midway through that statement, the position, the responsibility, that in a sense doesn't take it all the way to the conclusion, it seems to me that he's positing a particular kind of relationship between, one might say, faith and reason, between is and ought. And the first comment that you made about the title of this session, Faith, on faith, and your observation that there is an awful lot of faith in the sciences, notwithstanding the occlusion of it. I think that one of the things that's interesting to reflect on is the extent to which the sensibility to the truth is, in Benedict's account, linked to the imperative of faith. And while that is something to be celebrated on the religion side of the equation, if one says faith in relation to science, it feels awfully uncomfortable and maybe a bit embarrassing, maybe a bit more than a bit embarrassing. I wonder if you would reflect for us, in light of what you said about the is-ought relationship, not just about the problematic character of that distinction, in light of what one sees when one looks closely at the sciences, at science and technology, where one sees is and ought all tangled up together in precisely the way you put it. But if one also thinks about faith, about sensibility to the truth, about that as a virtue, even a constitutive virtue within the sciences, if one embraces that rather than is embarrassed by it, what does that say for how should we think about that sensibility, about reason, about sensibility to truth, as one sees greater homologies that maybe problematize the sort of is-ought distinction, secular religious distinction, public-private distinction, et cetera, because as you were pointing out, the participation in the forms of faith and the forms of deference that are required for the sciences to do science is just part and parcel of our modes of making sense, our collective sensibilities to the truth.
Well, so thanks, Ben. At this rate, we could be talking for an entire day, but let me begin with a piece of it. So let me begin with the discomfort. I mean, that scientists feel a kind of discomfort with the idea of faith. And of course, I think that it's not so much that, it's the faith in what, right? I mean, so the idea that there is I mean, if you look, for instance, at the creationism debates in America and the grounds on which they have been resolved, one of the directions in which the legal argumentation has gone is should these claims to putting science in as just another form of faith be thrown out on the grounds that there's nothing that science leaves unquestioned. There's no dogmatic starting point, which is taken as unquestionable. And, that's the difference between science and other forms of faith. No, I mean, where I picked out that sentence where he says, is it so? Is it really so wrong to be questioning whether there's a creator spiritus? I mean, back of. I mean, so that sentence struck me as something that the people inclined to an intelligent creator would have resonated with, and the scientist's response to that would have been uncomfortable because you're putting something exogenous out there. But if you instead say to science, I mean, do you have other things that are exogenous that you're not querying? The commitment to a vision of progress is something that the sciences actually hold on to, and somehow that more knowledge will lead to a better set of outcomes for humanity. And I don't know that there's a very good answer to the fact that here at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, I mean, this is like hundreds of years after the scientific revolution and after the Holocaust and the complete falling apart of the Western tradition in the middle of the previous century, and God knows how much bloodshed in between, we are not looking to a universally ameliorating world. We're talking about climate crisis. We're talking about problems of hunger because of population problems and climate disturbances. I, as a woman, can't help seeing that the power structures of the world are scarcely equal, and that the vast majority of the world today is going to be going to the polls, or did last year and this year, and voting for authoritarian leaders who you would have thought went out of fashion exactly 100 years or so ago, when women finally earned the right to vote across a wide swath of humanity. I mean, so it is not. I mean, there's plenty of objective, if you want to say objectivity is, can everybody who looks at it see this with their own eyes? Plenty of objective evidence that we're not going towards a progressive world, and yet there's some sense that science is going to take us toward that progressive world. So I think that the question of where is this faith lodged, and what do we see as exogenous variables, and what do we see as things we can put to the test or not put to the test, that is a useful kind of conversation to have. I also think there's a temporality side to this. I mean, like, what needs to be done first in order to achieve what? And, as we know from our affiliation with the sciences, the idea that if we find out how things work that we didn't know how they worked, that is then a foundation for building more. So we didn't understand fully how genes functioned. We know much better now, because now we understand the gene at the genomic level, and that has opened up a lot of doors, and now we can understand things like personalized medicine or whatever. But there is arguably a completely different way of understanding and responding to the human condition with science, and not through Kuhnian normal science, not even through scientific revolutions that still treat the advances in science as kind of internally driven. Science's own dynamics not only do, but should put the questions for the next era on the table. But supposing we began our questioning from a different place, supposing we in fact began with the injustices of the world, and the questions that theologians, and I'm, as then you no doubt know, a particular admirer of Anglophone religious poetry, even though it is hardly my tradition. But the why do sinners' ways prosper, that is a different place to start the querying running. And I think that the possibility of a place in the middle, that unfirm ground between the past and the future, between the faith and the objective knowledge, could be something that we come to by starting the questioning running from different ends. Do we start with the justice question and say, what knowledge do we need in order to live in this world and correct for it? Or do we start with the knowledge end of the equation and say that whatever we learn is a contribution, and then we have to find good ways to use it? But for sure, any novelty in learning will lead to a better world, because how can the ignorant possibly be worse off, possibly be better off than the knowing? So I think that there's that sort of what comes first, which of these sets of concerns, the humanistic or the ahistorical, as he puts it, and then how do we set the clock running, in a sense, once we've built that into the mechanism of the thing?
So it seems to me that the incipient imagination or imaginations of progress that you referred to are in the kind of socialization into the project of the sciences. One understands oneself as in the business of being here to validate, but in fact it's kneeling before. And it's not that there's anything wrong with kneeling before, when one is kneeling before what is worthy of veneration. And yet, as you're pointing out in the answer that you just gave, the question often begins with a sort of what can we do, not what does the world demand, what are the demands of justice, and what is the task of understanding associated with discerning those demands. And so I wonder, Sheila, if you would say something about, what the corrective what are the, I'm going to use a phrase that you've used, and then I'm going to let you elaborate that phrase. What are the sorts of technologies of humility that kind of the kneeling before that presents itself as merely validating, and thus not being responsible for the kinds of commitments that are being made? What are the sorts of, help us think a little bit about the kinds of technologies of humility, as you've put it, that are appropriate to the sciences, which live in a position of a kind of presumptive authority, live in the space, presumptively live in the space of public reason, or of universality, or of the public over against the private, and yet at the same time are not only contained within them, but in a sense are organized, or to a large degree organized around the sensibilities to progress that you referred to a moment ago.
It's a huge question, but I think, I mean, the dwelling on public reason itself needs to be put under, I think, a different kind of gaze, because we who were brought up in universities are academics. What do we think of as reason? I mean, first of all, we think of things that can be verbalized, right? I mean, that we can explain to others, persuade them, and if they do not believe us, then there's something the matter with them, and then we educate them and bring them forward. But I think reasoning itself can take a variety of forms that go back to this question about technologies of humility. If you see somebody bleeding to death, you don't stop to hold a homily or a lecture. You bind up their wounds, and this is, where does one find the call to action? Is the Gettysburg Address a better place to begin, or the second inaugural address, or is it the American Constitution, or is it 1953, the paper in Science demonstrating what the structure of DNA is? Now, I would say, of course, all those things are important. That the problem is not, I mean, it's not that we fail as human beings to generate texts of all these kinds, but where is the coming together of these things that animates the what is to be done question, and how should we move? And it's according a kind of false primacy to what Benedict refers to as the material. I mean, that essay I also read as a critique of materialism, that the search for the truth, the human wants to know everything that is, to understand what things are in the environment. But what things are is not a meaning devoid question, right? I mean, so can science make sense of life? I draw a simple-minded distinction, but apparently lots of people haven't thought about it. What a thing is and what a thing is for, right? I mean, I think that these are understood in very different ways. You talk to people coming from the medical sciences, and they will tell you that they do the medical sciences because they're primarily concerned in what are people here for. One thing that seems to be true about the rise of some of the more radical right-wing movements in the countries that I know and understand well is that they have gone into communities that felt left behind, whether religious minorities or poor communities or other deprived places, and there they have done a kind of public reason that was catering directly to the needs of the people left behind. My good story about this is the guy who ended up organizing the Amazon workers, who cooked food at home and brought it in little packets to catch the workers as they were coming out of the I mean, hungry after a day's work, and he had packaged food, and he delivered his homilies, I suppose. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what he said to them, but I think he got them to sign up to be in the union at the same time that he fed them. And, I think that the great religions have understood this juxtaposition between eating and faith, in a thoroughgoing way. I mean, so like, why does one have the Passover? I mean, it's all about what you get to eat when you're setting out on a major journey, right? So caring doesn't have to come through the sciences, and it doesn't have to be through that kind of persuasion. It can be, or it's not called experimentation, but how do we demonstrate love to people? I mean, is it an experiment each time one, goes to the nth soccer game with one's child on a heavily laden weekend when one also must grade 80 papers by the end of it and so on? I mean, what name do we have for those kinds of practices? And without those practices, we would be nowhere. So I think that that part of the ask for people like us is to get less abstract in a sense. I mean, part of the persuasive power of the sciences, ever since the experiments that Robert Boyle did and established an entire Royal Society to go with it, is the material demonstration that something works. But I think that we can all be committed to the idea that there's a need for demonstration that things work, and that's not in itself a bad thing. But works for what? For what purposes? For whom is it being made to work? And for whom is it not? How does one go at those? Now, I think one can today read normal science, read Kuhn, in a whole different way and say that normal science is not just bound by its paradigmatic narrowness, but also by the fact that it's never asking the question, what is this for? That is preordained and given. And one way that it can afford to be ahistorical, it's simply that it's denied that any other history is relevant. We got to this point because this is an important thing to be doing. And now we know what the next step is to take. We've already set this robotic machine in motion, and it knows how to take the next step. But I guess technologies of humility at its most loosest reading is a way of saying, ask what the questions came from and why you're asking those questions and not contiguous questions, and what would be gained if you opened up your mind to what other people see as the need for questions. And I think that there you would come to different sets of conclusions depending on where you then turn to. I mean, a doctrine, a powerful self-critical doctrine like Catholicism in all of its infinite variety has asked itself all kinds of questions, but there are certain things it takes as starting points that are not questionable. And we see from the liberalizations of the church and from its drawing in of its horns in any given historical period where it's willing to go and where it is not. And other people coming from other faith traditions might approach those same things in a very different way. So I think technologies of humility would also have to deal with where one's own blinders are coming from, where one doesn't see the need for examining, this other virtue that STSs like to talk about, though I think they seldom practice it, reflexivity. Where am I standing? Where am I coming from?
Okay, so I think there's time for audience questions, but I'll throw one more in.
Sure, if you want to throw one more, absolutely.
Yeah. So Sheila, because of where you ended up, I want to ask you to continue, and that is to also pick up on the point that you ended with. One of the things that we've been discussing here, or one of the themes that has recurrently come up, is is Benedict's reflections on the human as created, and the question, the problem of being human and the meaning of being human as a problem for every human being, which embeds that human being intrinsically embeds that human being in a relationship with the Creator, and without requiring that theological without requiring that last theological bit, the question, nevertheless, is a human question, and Benedict, I think, is quite clear on this in this speech as well. I think in the places where he talks about the responsibility of the Pope as a kind of ethical guide to humanity. It's speaking beyond a particular religious tradition and responding to that question of being human, which he also presents, as you did, as a question of sensibility to the truth. And so I wonder if you would say something about how, if we pull back from a presumption that the answer to the question of what is universal to us as human beings is the objective world and the potential for the objective knowledge of and control over the world that science offers us, and instead we begin with that human position, since what you've just said is that that human position is the position from which we should be asking that question that is abnormal in normal science, namely, what is this for and who is it for? To what end? With what purpose? And so you finished with this point about other traditions of truth. And I wonder if you would say something about how that project of encountering other traditions of truth, not for the purpose of sorting out who's got the right one, but more as a project of understanding expressions of sensibility to the truth. How should we think about that in relation to the position of science and technology in 21st century life?
I mean, I think, because we don't have a huge amount of time left, one of the things I would say is that the question of how science arrives as certain things as its questions and the purposes behind them are a thing that we should be setting beside other ways of asking the same sorts of questions. I mean, so even the recognition that the great disciplines, which include theological traditions, are in the business of sense-making, that they're asking questions about who are we, what is it all about, and they have different trained ways of approaching these things. So I think breaking down the particular extremely powerful ways that long-standing traditions have developed of asking those questions and saying, where's the same sort of thing being asked, but with a very different set of understandings or a very different set of ethical commitments of how you get to the bottom of things, would lead you to juxtapositions that are unconventional. So, if you read the storm scene in King Lear as an exercise in getting to the bottom of things, it is an incredibly powerful statement about what it takes to understand the meaning of being human. But you can read it as a tract on power. You can read it as a tract on the human hubris. But, to be a poor, bare, forked thing as thou art, I mean, why should one reject Shakespeare as a dead white male, right? I mean, when it is, in fact, to be read as a way in one language, languages having their own sort of musicality and tradition and etymologies and histories of addressing the grand questions, and then put that by other tragic moments. And, why have people in the Western tradition written about Antigone from generation to generation? I mean, what is it that grips? And then you can ask, what do the sciences tell us about these things? And of course, the sciences are very powerful, and they'll tell you about how the brain works and how you bury certain kinds of memory, and maybe you have a computer recovering things. But at some point you might also stop to ask what is immediate, what is what gets to people more. It's interesting that when scientists are taught how to communicate their results to people, the answers are never, just write the most elegant algorithm. It's tell the story in a different way. So it's one of those places where I think the kind of standard package training for the modern scientist in America is recognizing that there's a narrative dimension missing to the doing of science, which they're in effect being told to recover for these purposes, but they're being told to recover it for instrumental purposes. And I think technologies of humility, in part, that framework would say, don't start there with you needing to teach everybody why you're doing the thing you're doing. Start with, what are people wanting to know, and what is it that is today most bothersome about these things, and then see where the answers come from, which may not be, from the latest advancement in the particular frontiers inquiry that is being done in, whatever the fashionable science of the moment happens to be, but that models and the how you actually achieve something, come from elsewhere. The late lamented Steve Jobs, when he talked about his aesthetics having been formed through learning calligraphy, was in a way subscribing to that form of interdisciplinarity, if you will, or interculturalism, if you will, but in a sense displaying an uncharacteristic moment of humility as well. It wasn't from himself. It was appreciating the aesthetics by embedding himself in the practice of a different kind of discipline altogether. So, I think it's a complicated thing. We come back at the end, as we so often do in universities, about the what is to be taught question. And I think although Benedict stressed his role episcopos as being the bishop and the shepherd, there is this teaching dimension to the humanistic traditions of understanding the human, that to some extent you test what you're teaching by its teachability, in a sense. These days everybody talks in a light way about relatability, but I think one could talk about teachability, but from a position where those being taught are teaching the teacher how to teach, and not the other way around. So those are just a cluster of reflections on what you said.
Thank you very much for that response. Before we leave, can I ask if there are any quick questions from the audience? Wonderful. Professor Jansenov, as one of the modern scientists that you spoke about in your final response, I really appreciate what you said about us as scientists needing to recover that missing piece from the narrative. In my theological training, I'm being reminded of that missing piece on a daily basis. So thank you for naming that. I appreciate that. And with that, would you join me in thanking both of our panelists, please?